This is part two of the coming of the American Revolution, and as we continue along our road to the salutary neglect and benign neglect, the set of circumstances that helped produce the American Revolution, there are some facets of American independence and independent habits and practices that need our attention. Again, as I have said, the story of the taxes and the fabled Tea Party and all that stuff does not make complete sense. It's just like, well, they were arguing over taxes. Well, yeah, they were. But with the coming of the American Revolution, you have to have this underlying foundation of independence in various forms and in various ways and in various aspects of one's life or a community or a culture's life to help bring this about. And so here we are to start with is that with regard to the difference between England and the American colonies, here's something that's worth a note in your time. With regard to the American colonies and England, in England, we were talking about property ownership within Lockean theory. One of the things that you've noticed in England is that the elite, the nobility, owned most of the land. 70% of the land and property was owned by 30% of the population. And basically what it boiled out to is that you have a lot of Englishmen and Scottish and so forth who are in fact really just renters and not landowners or homeowners or anything of that nature. Compared that to the United States or the future United States, where most of the land is owned by most of the people, in the sense that you have, yes, some landed property giants in the Tidewater and elsewhere, but land is clearly dispersed amongst the various people. There's land galore for everyone in Pennsylvania, Virginia, Massachusetts, and so forth. And if you don't like what you see there, you can go westward and take your lot and take your family and take your chances in the Appalachians and so forth. So there's plenty of land to go around. It's also something else worth noting, too, with regard to American practices and independent habits, is that the early colonial legislatures, in whatever form exactly they took, there was a certain amount of democracy and a certain amount of voting and suffrage that goes along with these legislatures. Now, obviously, not everybody who is eligible to vote in 2017 or whenever you watch this video would be eligible to vote in 1750. But the reality is that you do not have near the restrictions on voting in the colonies that you have in England. And on top of that, those landed gentry types who would consider themselves blue-blooded Englishmen, even though they lived in the colonies, they would have to go and get votes from the people that they may not have liked all that much. They would have, just have to get votes from, quite honestly, have to get votes out in the countryside and talk to folks who they would consider their social inferiors. So there's a mixing and an equality, and I don't mean to push that word too far, but there is a mixing amongst the people that you don't see in England. And so that's part of the American independent spirit, that just because you were born of a certain station doesn't mean you'll always be that station, and it also doesn't mean that you were some sort of renter or serf, and so on. So, but beyond that, however, one of the things you also saw too is that early on, say take Virginia for an example, early on after the development of the Virginia Company, and then of course the early on collapse of the Virginia Company because it ran out of money and the failures of Jamestown and so forth, those stragglers and those guys left behind in Virginia, they had to govern themselves. And though not explicitly legal, the fact is that Virginia is going to establish a House of Burgess, which is their legislature. And they basically set up their own practices and habits that's going to last Virginia for almost 150 years. So, I mean, I think it was 1622, 1626, right around there, is when the Burgess is formed for the first time. But this Burgess is going to act as a lawmaking body and on top of that as a taxing authority for Virginia. And so in that sense, they are freemen who are acting in Virginia's interests. They're not anti-British. That's way into the future. But still, we do it our way. And you see that again and again. And there's also later on an interesting vignette in Unto a Good Land about how the Virginia legislature would purposefully, in the 1700s, purposefully circumvent rules that were designed to perhaps bring the Burgess to heel. And they would send it using uh, legal maneuvering and so forth. They would send appeals across the Atlantic Ocean, and it takes time, and they would change it. It's really a circuitous process. But it basically helped give Virginia a modicum of independence. In fact, a good deal of independence from the mother country and the mothership of England. But that's just only Virginia. Up and down the colonial coast, you find these independent-minded legislatures, these independent-minded people, one way or the other, exercising their rights, as they would say it, and exercising their practices and their government. In the state of Massachusetts, the colony of Massachusetts, the legislature in Massachusetts was also a powerful legislature that could be very tough on appointed royal governors, many of whom, frankly, these royal governors are very satisfied to not rock the boat and to leave things well enough alone. The reality also is that, like Virginia, the Massachusetts legislature had taxing and law writing authorities that were somewhat true and then sometimes less official, but still they exercised them. We do it our way, and we do it independently. Not completely with a thumb in the eye, but it certainly is going to push the envelope all the same. So you've got Massachusetts with a strong legislature, Virginia with a strong House of Burgess, which amounts to a legislature. The state of New York, or the colony of New York, has independent stripes and minds. One of the classic examples of Virginia or New York is one of their governors who was a high-handed man, a fellow named Lord Cornbury. He acted like he had been handed down from heaven and sent to ride herd on those unruly New Yorkers. But if you know anything about New York, and hopefully you've done your reading on New York was originally established as a Dutch Reformed colony, meaning those were old Dutch Calvinists. And you know as well as I do the Calvinists, which also had a strain in Puritanism, which frankly was Puritanism in England. The Calvinists, they didn't have much use for this Church of England. So there's that old religious issues there. And in fact, actually, Lord Cornbury, one of the things he railed against was he called them basically strolling preachers, meaning these Presbyterian unlicensed preachers who wander around and preach unlicensed and unneeded. Cornbury, is going to lock horns time and again with the New York Assembly, the New York legislature, and time and again he'll eventually lose and be recalled. But also what was noteworthy too about New York's independence quirks and habits and frankly old religious hostilities that take form in political defiance is that New York was going to establish a new college in 1755, 6, I don't have the note in front of me, but it's King's College. And by the way, King's College becomes Columbia University. Columbia University was originally going to be established as an Anglican college. And not only just as an outside Anglican, but it was also that the people of New York, or the kids who were going to attend the college or university, were going to have to be Anglican communicants, meaning members of the Anglican Church. And on top of that, there was going to be the professorials, like myself, would have to be an Anglican Church member. And considering the background in New York and the fact that you're coming off the Great Awakening and that return of religious feeling, there were a lot of Presbyterians who said no, and almost like hell no. We're not going to have that. We're not going to support, and you're not going to compel me to support a college that excludes my people because of their Presbyterian backgrounds. So you have this defiant spirit that boils up in New York over the actions of a high-handed governor and Lord Cornbury, and on top of that, because of the establishment of a college like the future Columbia University. Eventually they back down, but still the feeling is made and noted that you can't force this on this. You can't make us support something we don't want to. We go down the line. in South Carolina, you see a strong legislature that kind of does what it wants, and normally is paired with a weak governor who, as long as he gets to eat and drink and be merry, he's pretty much a passive character. South Carolina has a long history of being, one, aristocratic, and also being independent minded with through its legislature. We do it our way in South Carolina. In North Carolina, particularly, but in the backwoods of the Carolinas generally, meaning the mountains where the Scotch Irish are, in the 1750s, you're going to have a series of rebellions. You're going to have a series of marauding Indians. You're going to have a breakdown in law and order in the backwoods there amongst those tumultuous Scotch Irish borderlanders. In Borderland or Scotch Irish tradition, you have the clans, but you also have something else too. And that tradition is the idea of the regulator and the moderator. The regulator would be the group of vigilantes who come up to crush rampant, I guess you could say, rampant lawlessness, like bank robbers run amok, cattle thieves run amok, people who rob and pillage run amok. In addition to the regulator movement, then you have the moderators who would be, if the regulators got too wild and too big for their britches, normally what would happen is that the counter push or counterattack would come from other aspects of the community in the moderators who would try to break the regulator movement. It's vigilantism 101. But the backwoods of the Carolinas in the 1760s, had a breakdown in law and order. And as you may recall from a previous lecture, that breakdown in law and order basically is going to demonstrate the idea that something has gone terribly wrong in society, that virtue is under attack, liberty is under attack, there are marauding forces, and more especially the government is doing nothing to protect us. So and there's a quote in there, basically that this regulator approvingly had said, we shut down the constables that were corrupt, we drove off the criminals, the whores were whipped, and peace and prosperity prevailed. That's more of a paraphrase than a direct quote, but some of those words I used were direct quotes. You can check it in Unto a Good Land. That's where I got the quote from. But the point is that you're going to see in the backwoods of the Carolinas and in some other instances in Virginia too, there's going to be this kind of vigilante spirit that gets going. And so the Carolinas, they are a hotbed of we do it our way sentiment. We do what we want. And in fact, actually, the last colony we're going to look at in this very brief overview, 12 minutes long now, I suppose, but this brief overview is the colony of Pennsylvania. As I've said to you before, by 1756, the Quakers were in eclipse, never able to recruit enough to their aesthetic way of life. No sex, restrain yourself, moderation above all things, and equality that most Englishmen were not ready to accept, or Scotch-Irish for that matter too. Pacifism, forget that. No drinking, no thank you. So the Quakers, they may have established through William Penn and his family and been the leaders of Pennsylvania, and the Quakers will still be very prominent players. Reality is that the Pennsylvania goes from being a Quaker stronghold to being basically a lost colony by the Quakers by the middle part of the 1700s, 1756 as I recall. But still, the fact of the matter is that Pennsylvania, you have a change in the guard, and old folks losing power, new people coming in gaining power, and then throw into your mix as well the fact that you've got those borderlander Scotch-Irish that the Quakers thought were wolf-like creatures who had gone to the interior, and because of their complaints with Quaker rule and so forth, and some frankly some unfounded rumors and so forth, they call them the Paxton boys, the Paxton mob, broke loose and started murdering pacifist Indians, believe it or not. Then the mob got going, and about 300 to 400 of them marched upon Philadelphia and were about to sack the capital of Quaker Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. And it wasn't but Ben Franklin and a couple of his friends who, on behalf of the Quakers, negotiated a settlement with the Paxton boys. Now, the Paxton Boys were the worst of the vigilante marauder types in their own right, yet they were able to run amok through the community, and it seems like law and orders broke down. You have, in many respects, this independent spirit that is in trouble, or rather, is not in trouble, is asserting itself. You put all this together, plus maybe some other things. In fact, I know other things that are just I'm leaving out. You put all this together, you have the recipe for a community receptive, a culture receptive to the inklings of independence, because we do it our way. You Englishmen don't think of us much anyhow, and now you're trying to deny our liberty and take our rights by taxing us to the hilt. And as we draw this little brief lecture to a close, what we should look at and keep in mind is that the colonies, as you come towards 1763, and that's a year you probably ought to remember, because the colonies in 1763 had been largely controlled by, and I guess you could say had been not controlled by, had been aided by British Army, the British Army and British might. And that's worth noting too. The British in 1763, the British had sent a garrison of soldiers to North America. About, as I recall, about 7,500 were stationed all throughout the colonies. The problem was 1763, those soldiers, well, it cost a pretty penny to send them. They don't do all that much as far as protect the people. And oh, by the way, many British soldiers laughed at American settlers. They had no use for them, and they were pretty bawdy. And American settlers or colonists had no compunction or love for most of the British soldiers who were sent here, the Redcoats. And so in 1763, though, the British had fought several wars of proxy and wars that might be called brushfire wars over the last 75, 80 years in the colonies, culminating with really a world war in the 7 Years' War, aka the French and Indian War. The British Empire was in the throes and in deep need of money. And so that sets you up for all those taxes that are going to be levied by the Parliament. Internal taxes on paper, on almanacs, on this and that, tea, sugar. You go on the list. It's an extensive list that the colonies are going to have to pay for, at least according to the Parliament. The Parliament claims that right as the governing authority of England to do so. And the colonists say, no, you can't. Not without representation, and frankly, we've been doing it ourselves for some time. Thank you very much. We have protected ourselves when you didn't care about us. And the mindset and the words ratchet up, up, and up. So that's a good place to stop, and we'll bring this part of the lecture to a close. Thank you. Have a good day.